İlk konuşmacım fazale Rana. Doktor Rana, Reason to Believe'in araştırma bölümü başkan yardımcısı olan, biyokimya dalında uzmanlığı bulunan Rana, biyokimya, genetik ve sentetik biyoloji alanlarında çalışmalar yapmış. Yaratılışın bilimsel delilleri konusunda 2 kitabı bulunmakta. Birçok makalesi, belgeseli, podcast'ı bulunan Rana, çeşitli televizyon ve radyo röportajlarının yanı sıra 500'den fazla üniversitede, kuruluşta ve kilisede konuşmacı olmuş. Doktor Rana 2 defa Doktor Klimter araştırma ödülüne layık ve Virginia Üniversitesi, Georgia Üniversitesi'nde hücre zarlarının yapısı konusunda doktora tezi hazırlamış. Yazdığı makaleler o kadar çok ki, Chemist, Applied, ABC, Journal of Microbiology, Methods and Journal of Chemical bilimsel dergilerde yayınlanmış. Görürken, evrim senaryolarının hayatın başlangıcını açıklayamayacağını ve hayatın bir yaratıcı tarafından var edilmiş olması gerektiğini anlayan Doktor Rana, kendisini bu gerçeği insanlara anlatmaya adamış. Doktor Rana bugün 2 ayrı konuda konuşma yapacak. Birincisi, yaratıcının var olduğuna neden inanıyorum başlıklı konuşmasında biyokimya, hayatın kökeni ve sentetik biyoloji alanlarındaki son gelişmeler ışığında yaratılışın delillerini ve evrim teorisinin geçersizliğini anlatacak. Doktor Rana'nın 2. konuşmasını da daha sonra açıklamak istiyorum. Peki, floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. I am truly honored to be here today. It really is a privilege to be part of this conference. We live in a world today where there's so much conflict that it's refreshing to be part of a project where the goal is to show the world that Christians and Muslims can work together towards a common goal, showing that there's scientific evidence for God's existence, and also showing that there's genuine scientific challenges to the evolutionary paradigm. Both are objectives that Muslims and Christians can agree upon. And the second point, that there are scientific challenges to the theory of evolution, is very important. Because if evolutionary mechanisms can explain the origin and the history and the design of life, then both believers and non-believers alike can rightly ask, what role then is there for a creator? In fact, evolutionary biologist and atheist Richard Dawkins says in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And it's statements like these that cause many people to conclude around the world that conflict exists between science and religion, with science eventually winning the war. In August of 2015, the Pew Research Foundation in the United States published data showing that 75% of people who never attend church or seldom attend church think that there's conflict between science and religion. And you have to wonder if that perception of conflict is the reason why they refuse to entertain the possibility of God's existence. Tragically, 50% of people who attend church on a regular basis in the United States think there's conflict. This is a very sad state of affairs. And yet, it was science that brought me to the conviction that a creator must exist. When I entered college, I was an agnostic. I didn't know if God existed or not, and I honestly didn't care. I simply wasn't interested in religion as a young man. The focus of my attention was biochemistry. I wanted to do everything that I could to prepare myself to go to graduate school to earn a PhD in biochemistry. As an undergraduate student, I was convinced that evolutionary mechanisms could account for the origin, the history, and the design of biological systems. But my convictions were not based on a careful examination of the evidence, but instead they were based on what my biology professors taught me. I admired my professors, and because I respected them, I accepted what they said about evolution uncritically. In many ways, my acceptance of the evolutionary paradigm fueled my agnosticism. When I speak on university campuses in the United States, I run into students who, like me, think that evolution is a fact, but it's not because they've examined the evidence, it's because their professors have taught them that very truth, or that claimed truth. When I went to graduate school, my views changed. You might say that biochemistry convinced me that God must exist. One of the primary goals of graduate education is to teach students to independently think through the scientific evidence and develop conclusions based on the evidence alone, regardless of what other scientists say. And because I was learning to think for myself, I was willing to ask questions that I did not ask as an undergraduate student. One of those questions was, how did life originate? The elegant design, sophistication, and ingenuity of biochemical systems prompted me to ask that question. I wanted to know, how does the scientific community account for the origin of such remarkable biochemical systems through strict mechanistic processes? After examining the various explanations available at the time, it was 30 years ago, I know I look much younger than that, but it was 30 years ago, I was shocked. The explanations presented by the scientific community seemed to me to be woefully inadequate. I was convinced that chemical and physical processes could not generate life. This realization, coupled with the elegant design of biochemical systems, forced me to the only conclusion possible, for intellectual reasons alone, that a creator must indeed exist and must have been responsible for bringing life into being. I reached that conclusion over 30 years ago. In the prevailing decades, the scientific evidence has continued to affirm my conclusion about God's existence. The case that can be made today for God's existence from biochemistry and the problems associated with the origin of life has even become more compelling than 30 years ago. And the goal of my lecture is to present to you the reasons why I think that God exists as a biochemist. And to summarize my argument, you just need to remember three words: fingerprints, failure, and fashion. A creator's fingerprints are evident in biochemical systems. All attempts to explain the origin of life, and hence the origin of biochemical systems, through chemical evolution have resulted in failure. And then finally, attempts to create or fashion life in the lab show powerfully that a creator must be responsible for the origin of life. Let's go ahead and take a look at the first point. A creator's fingerprints are evident in biochemical systems. As a biochemist, one of the things that I find absolutely remarkable is that the hallmark features of the cell's chemical systems are identical to those features that we would recognize as evidence for the work of a human designer. In other words, when human beings design, create, invent systems and objects and devices, those things that we make have certain properties that reflect the work of a mind. And it's provocative to think that those same features are defining biochemistry in its very essence. So if certain features reflect the work of a human mind and we see them in biochemical systems, is this not evidence that they too must be the work of a mind? Because of time constraints, I'm only going to focus on one of these features today, namely the fact that there are information systems found inside the cell. At their essence, biochemical systems are information systems. And there are two major classes of biomolecules that harbor information. Nucleic acids, such as DNA and RNA. DNA is depicted on the left. And proteins. Both types of molecules are chain-like in nature. These molecules are formed when the cell's machinery links together smaller subunit molecules in a head-to-tail fashion to form molecular chains. In the case of DNA and RNA, the subunits are nucleotides, sometimes called genetic letters, abbreviated A, G, C, and T. In the case of proteins, the subunit molecules are amino acids. There are 20 amino acids that are encoded by the genetic code. Biochemists often think of the nucleotides used to build DNA and RNA and the amino acids used to build proteins as molecular alphabets. Just as alphabets are used to build words in the English language or in the Turkish language, amino acid sequences are used to construct biochemical words, proteins that carry out specific functions inside the cell. Nucleotide sequences are used to store information in DNA. In fact, the function of DNA is to store information that the cell's machinery will use to build proteins. And the regions of the DNA molecule that contain the information needed to build a single protein is called a gene. So the recognition that biochemical systems are information systems indicates that life must come from a mind. Why? Because whenever we encounter information, we recognize that there is a mind behind that information. When you receive a text message, when you receive an email, if you receive a letter in the mail, or you see a sign on the road, you immediately conclude that there is a mind that undergirds that information. So in like manner, when we see that biochemical systems harbor information, that is the first indication that these come from a mind. But the case for a creator doesn't rest solely on the existence of information in the cell. The argument is much more sophisticated. As it turns out, information theorists who've studied problems in molecular biology have come to the conclusion that the structure of the cell's information is identical to the structure of human language in its organization. It's not merely the presence of information, but the fact that that information is organized in the same way that we organize information. There is a language inside the cell. One of the most provocative insights I've ever learned relates to the structure and the function of biochemical information. In fact, this insight keeps me awake at night as I think through the implications. It turns out that the biochemical machinery that manipulates DNA is literally functioning like a computer system at its basic essence. And because this insight is so critical, I think, to the case for a creator, I'd like to spend a little time elaborating on this point. And to understand that, we need to think through the theoretical construct of a computer system. The theoretical basis for computer systems are abstract machines called Turing machines. These are not actual machines, but rather abstract entities that exist in the mind of the computer scientist. Turing machines are simple. They consist of three parts. The input, which is a string of data that goes into something called a finite control. And that finite control alters that string of data in a limited but prescribed manner, producing an output string of data. And this is a cartoon showing a hypothetical Turing machine. It turns out that you can link the output of one Turing machine to the input to another Turing machine. And in doing so, you can take rather simple machines and combine them to perform complex operations. As it turns out, this is precisely what happens when the cell's machinery manipulates DNA. For example, during the process of DNA replication, where the DNA, which harbors digital information, can be thought of as being the input, and the proteins or the enzymes that manipulate DNA during replication can be thought of as the finite controls. So here's a cartoon showing DNA replication, where again, the DNA represents the input and the output, and the enzymes that manipulate DNA are the finite controls. In other words, when the cell's machinery replicates DNA, it's as if a computer system is operating in the very interior of the cell. Because of the similarity between how computer systems function in processes like DNA replication, computer scientists have been inspired to develop a new technology called DNA computing. DNA computing essentially is based on DNA and the proteins that are found inside the cell that manipulate DNA. But these DNA computers are found inside little tiny test tubes that are this size. And these computers are more powerful than the most powerful silicon-based computer system that we have. They're more powerful than supercomputer systems. And the reason is because you can perform massive parallel operations simultaneously. The brainchild, DNA computing is the brainchild of a computer scientist by the name of Leonard Adleman, who's at the University of Southern California. And this is what Leonard Adleman says about DNA computing. The most important thing about DNA computing is that it shows that DNA molecules can do what we normally think only computers can do. This implies that computer science and biology are closely related, that living things can be thought of as computing something, and that sometimes we can understand living things better by looking at them as computers. Again, DNA computing highlights the remarkable similarities between human designs and the designs that we see inside the cell. And we can make advantage of these astounding similarities to construct a formal argument for God's existence by following in the footsteps of British natural theologian William Paley. In the late 1700s, Paley wrote a book called Natural Theology. In this work, Paley advanced one of the best-known arguments in the West for God's existence, the watchmaker argument. Paley reasoned this way: just as a watch requires a watchmaker, life requires a divine watchmaker. In Paley's day, a watch was the pinnacle of engineering achievement. Paley pointed out that a watch is a contrivance, a machine composed of a number of parts that interact precisely to accomplish a purpose. Paley contrasted the operation of a watch with a rock. Paley argued that a rock finds explanation through the outworkings of natural processes, but a watch requires a mind to explain its existence. Based on a survey of biological systems, Paley concluded that living systems have more in common with a watch than a rock. And if a watch requires a watchmaker to explain its existence, then by analogy, living systems require a mind to explain their existence. Advances in biochemistry allow us to bring the watchmaker argument up to date. We know from common experience that computer systems, the pinnacle of engineering achievements in our day, require a mind, in fact many minds, to explain their existence. And because we find computer systems operating within the cell, we can reasonably conclude that life requires a divine mind to account for its existence. I find the watchmaker argument to be compelling. Yet in my experience, when I present this argument to skeptics, they will argue that evolutionary processes can serve as the watchmaker. In fact, they regard those processes as a blind watchmaker. Oops. This idea is articulated by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, where Darwin says this: Paley had the proper reverence for the complexity of the living world, and he saw that it demands a very special kind of explanation. The only thing he got wrong was the explanation itself. The true explanation had to wait for Charles Darwin. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of a watchmaker in nature, it is a blind watchmaker. And this brings me to the second point in my argument. Failure. All attempts to explain the origin of life and hence the origin of biochemical systems through chemical evolution or a blind watchmaker have resulted in failure. In order to appreciate this point, we must first have a very quick review of the way in which biochemists categorize biomolecules. We've talked about information-harboring molecules like DNA and proteins. But there's another class of molecules in the cell. These are small molecules that react with each other to form linear pathways and branch pathways and circular pathways. These are all interconnected with each other to form a vast network of chemical reactions in the cell. And these reactions harvest energy for the cell to use. They produce the cell's building blocks. These are referred to as intermediary metabolic pathways. And then finally, the third category are cell membranes. These are boundaries that separate the interior of the cell from the exterior environment. Or they separate compartments inside the cells. And each category of biomolecules has spawned different scenarios for the origin of life that are called replicator first scenarios, metabolism first scenarios, and membrane first scenarios. And according to the replicator first scenario, it was information-rich molecules like DNA and RNA and proteins that emerged first, and metabolism and membranes are secondary features. Metabolism first scenarios argue it was metabolism that emerged first, and then information-rich molecules and membranes as secondary features. And then finally, membrane first scenarios argue it was cell membranes that appeared first. It's important to realize that each approach proposed by origin of life researchers suffers from intractable problems. For example, when it comes to replicator first scenarios, the problems are legion. And I'm not going to discuss these problems this morning because of time constraints. My colleague, Anjanette Roberts, will talk a little bit about some of these problems with replicator first scenarios. But I want to tell you a story that illustrates how significant the problem is. A number of years ago, I attended an Origin of Life conference in Oaxaca, Mexico. This conference was called ISIL 2002. This meeting attracted some of the best Origin of Life researchers around the world, and the opening lecture of that conference was delivered by a scientist by the name of Leslie Orgel. When he was alive, Orgel was considered the preeminent Origin of Life researcher in the world. And he was given the honor at this conference of presenting the opening lecture to the conference. And he was asked to summarize the status of the RNA world hypothesis, an idea that he was one of the originators of. Throughout his lecture, Orgel detailed problem after problem after problem with the RNA world scenario. And towards the end of his talk, he paused and he said, "I hope there are no creationists in the audience. But it would be a miracle if a strand of RNA ever appeared on the primitive Earth." It's remarkable. Orgel was known as an outspoken atheist, yet in an honest moment he had to acknowledge that the origin of life, at least from a replicator first standpoint, appeared to be basically a miracle. Metabolism first scenarios fare no better. Again, there are problem after problem after problem that we could identify with these scenarios. Because of time, I'm not going to go into them. But I'm just going to simply say this, that when Orgel was alive, one of the last scientific journal articles he wrote was a critical review of metabolism first scenarios, where he said that these scenarios require an appeal to magic, a series of remarkable coincidences, a near miracle. And finally, when it comes to membrane first scenarios, they too are riddled with problems. And some of those problems are listed on this slide. Again, I'm not going to go into the details because of time constraints. But a few years ago, a chemist by the name of Jackie Thomas and I published a paper in a journal called Origins of Life and Evolution of Biospheres. This is one of the world's leading origin of life research journals. We detailed the problems associated with membrane first scenarios. This was a remarkable achievement because both Jackie Thomas and I are creationists. And yet the problems we identified with membrane first scenarios are so significant, even evolutionary biologists had to acknowledge that our critique was legitimate. The editor-in-chief of the journal consented to publish our critical assessment of membrane first scenarios in this premier Origin of Life research journal. In other words, every attempt to explain the origin of life has resulted in failure from an evolutionary standpoint. When it comes to the origin of life, you cannot say there is a blind watchmaker. When I present this evidence to origin of life researchers, they are very quick to agree that at this point in time we have no explanation for the origin of life. But they argue that we still think that we might be able to explain chemical evolution someday because of successes that they claim to have in the laboratory, where they've been able to make, for example, building block materials through what are called prebiotic chemical experiments. Or they can make biopolymers or evolve RNA molecules in the lab or make self-replicating systems and manufacture protocells. And they point to this and they say, this demonstrates that chemical evolution could be conceivable. And this brings me to the third point of my argument, fashion. Attempts to create or fashion life in the lab make a very powerful case for a creator. When chemists go into the lab to perform prebiotic chemistry studies, they are working under highly controlled conditions. They carefully assemble the glassware. They fill the glassware with the appropriate solvents. They add the just right chemicals in the just right time and the just right concentrations. They control the temperature of the reaction. They control the pH of the reaction. They stop the reaction at the just right time. In other words, the chemists are contributing to the success of the prebiotic chemistry studies. It is highly questionable if these highly controlled conditions would have ever existed on the early Earth. While chemists may be present in the laboratory today, they were not present on the early Earth to oversee prebiotic chemistry. To put it another way, intelligent agency ensures the success of these prebiotic reactions in the lab. And let me illustrate this point by discussing the RNA world hypothesis. The centerpiece of this idea is the notion that the very first biochemistry was based on RNA. Later, the RNA world evolved to give rise to the DNA protein world that characterizes contemporary biochemistry. There are a number of lines of evidence that origin of life researchers like to point to in favor of the RNA world hypothesis. I'm only going to tell you one of those lines of evidence, and this has to do with the ability to make RNA on clay surfaces in the laboratory. In the mid-1990s, when this was accomplished, this was heralded as a huge breakthrough in favor of the RNA world hypothesis. But when you examine the details of the experiments, it very quickly becomes evident that intelligent agency was critical for this process to take place. Researchers, for example, have to operate under highly chemically pristine conditions. They have to exclude materials that would interfere with the production of RNA chains. They have to exclude materials that will cause the RNA molecules to break down once they form. These materials would have been present in abundance on the early Earth, but again, they're excluded from their experiments. They have to stop the reaction before the RNA chain gets too long, because if it gets too long, it becomes irreversibly attached to the clay surface. They also have to use what are called chemically activated nucleotides. These materials would never have existed on the early Earth, and if they did somehow, they would be so chemically reactive, they would react with everything in sight and would not be available to make RNA molecules. In addition, the clay that's used has to come from a specific supplier in the United States. That clay has to be treated in the just right way in the laboratory. If not, it could not be used as a catalyst for this reaction. This is what Paul Davies, an astrobiologist, has said about the RNA world hypothesis. As far as biochemists can see, it's a long and difficult road to produce efficient RNA replicators from scratch. This conclusion has to be that without a trained organic chemist on hand to supervise, nature would be struggling to make RNA from a dilute soup under any plausible prebiotic conditions. Evolutionary biologist Simon Conway Morris goes one step further. Many of the experiments designed to explain one or other step in the origin of life are either of tenuous relevance to any believable prebiotic setting or involve an experimental rig in which the hand of the researcher becomes, for all intents and purposes, the hand of God. This is ironic. The very experiments that these scientists perform to try to demonstrate the validity of chemical evolution and a blind watchmaker approach to the origin of life have unwittingly demonstrated that intelligent agency is the key ingredient in the transformation of non-living molecules to life. This conclusion, and I'm going to close in just a minute, this conclusion is further illustrated by work in synthetic biology. Synthetic biology is a relatively new area of biology where the goal is to create artificial life in the lab. And one of the goals is to make protocells, starting with simple chemicals and to try to make cellular entities. And it becomes readily apparent when you examine this work how important intelligent agency is. And let me illustrate this by talking about a study done a few years ago where researchers were trying to make an enzyme from scratch, unlike anything that existed in nature. An enzyme can be thought of just a small component in the overall machinery of the cell. It took a team of quantum chemists, computational chemists, protein engineers, biochemists, and molecular biologists to pull this off, and it required hundreds of hours of supercomputer time to model the chemistry. And they had to use structural motifs from biology to build the proteins. It required highly skilled scientists working in highly controlled conditions in the laboratory, utilizing sophisticated chemical instrumentation that itself was intelligently designed to pull this off. And what they made was laughable compared to what you see in nature. Although our results demonstrate that novel enzyme activity can be designed from scratch, they write, and indicate the catalytic strategies that are most accessible to nascent enzymes, there is still a significant gap between the activities of our design catalysts and those of naturally occurring enzymes. There is no blind watchmaker. And so when you look at these three facts, that when we examine biochemical systems, we see evidence for the work of a mind. We see a creator's fingerprints. When we can show that every attempt to explain the origin of life through chemical evolution has led to failure, and when we can show that attempts to create life in the lab unequivocally demonstrate the necessary role of intelligent agency, we're really left with one conclusion: that life itself must come from the work of a mind. And it's gratifying to me to think that 30 years later, the conclusions I came to as a young graduate student are valid. And if you are open-minded and you really follow the evidence where it leads, in my view, there's only one conclusion, and that is there has to be a creator. There has to be a creator that brought life into existence. And so the question then becomes for all of us, who is that creator? How do we relate to that creator? Which are far more important questions than whether or not a creator exists, in my opinion. Thank you so much.
Şimdi biz tekrardan Sayın Doktor Rana'ya dönüyoruz. Ve bize bu sefer ikinci bölümde anlatmak istediği şey, İnsanın tesadüfi yani evrimsel süreçle cansız maddelerden oluşamayacağını, akıl ve konuşma yeteneğine sahip bir varlık olduğunu bilimsel delillerle anlatacak. The floor is yours. Thank you. And your time is 30 minutes again. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It's good to see you again. Hope you feel the same way about seeing me up here a second time. In the West, one of the most contentious areas in the creation-evolution controversy centers around the question of human origins. And the reason for this is because what we think about our origins really matters. And let me illustrate this point by spending just a few minutes thinking through with you some of the implications of the prevailing scientific view of human origins, namely human evolution. The scientific consensus is that human beings are the product of an evolutionary process that began 6 to 7 million years ago, where presumably an ape-like creature spawned an evolutionary lineage that culminated in the emergence of modern humans. Many scientists interpret the hominids in the fossil record, creatures like Lucy, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Neanderthals, as transitional forms documenting the evolutionary ascent of humankind. If this story is correct, then human beings are not the product of a creator's hand. Instead, we have no special status. We are merely one of a countless number of species that have existed throughout Earth's history. This point is powerfully illustrated in this diagram, which shows the evolutionary tree of life for every major group of organisms that has existed throughout the last 3.8 billion years of Earth's history. In this diagram, human beings are merely a minor twig on a very small branch of the evolutionary tree of life. We are an irrelevant part of life's vast evolutionary network. This is where human beings appear on this particular diagram. But the implications are actually more troubling when we consider the nature of the evolutionary process. Biological evolution is unguided and historically contingent, without any direction or goal. If human evolution is truly a fact, then there can be no ultimate meaning or purpose to human existence. This is how the late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould described the implications of the evolutionary process in his book, Wonderful Life. This means that we must face the implications squarely, that the origin of Homo sapiens as a tiny twig on an improbable branch of a contingent limb on a fortunate tree lies well below the boundary. In Darwin's scheme, we are a detail, not a purpose or an embodiment of the whole, with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we may call chance. This view of humanity, which flows out of the evolutionary account of human origins, is devastating in my opinion. Because of science's influence in our world today, the evolutionary account of human origins pervades cultures around the world. I spent some time this past spring in Cambodia interacting with people who had virtually no education, and the question that kept coming up to me was, how do you explain human evolution? This view of humanity is responsible for many of the social ills we see in the world today. This view of humanity is responsible for the rampant immorality that pervades cultures around the world. If human beings are merely animals, the product of unguided, historically contingent evolutionary processes, then human life has no inherent value. Human beings lack any dignity. If human evolution is true, then we are not accountable to a creator. We can do whatever we want to do. In this presentation, I'd like to provide a scientific response to the challenge of human evolution. I hope to show you that the scientific case for human evolution is not open and shut. I hope to show you that there is scientific merit to viewing human beings as the product of a creator's handiwork, specially endowed with intelligence and the capacity for speech, qualities necessary for human beings assigned as God's vice-regents on earth, concepts that are taught both in the Bible and in the Quran as I understand it. A significant part of my response today will focus on the role philosophy plays in the operation of contemporary science. Methodological naturalism is the philosophical framework for contemporary science. This concept is distinct, yet related to philosophical naturalism. According to philosophical naturalism, all that exists is the material physical universe. There is no supernatural. There is no reality outside the universe. There is no God. As the late astronomer Carl Sagan, an atheist, once quipped, the universe is all that there was, is, and ever will be. In contradistinction to philosophical naturalism, methodological naturalism claims to be metaphysically neutral on the question of God's existence. But according to the tenets of methodological naturalism, when one engages in the scientific enterprise, it's necessary to suspend belief in God, regardless of one's personal convictions. The only allowed explanations for the universe and phenomena within the universe, like the origin of humanity, must be natural process mechanistic explanations. According to methodological naturalism, one cannot appeal to the supernatural. It doesn't mean that the supernatural doesn't exist. Simply put, the supernatural is not given a place in the scientific project. In other words, if you believe God exists, your views cannot influence the way in which you conduct science. Methodologically speaking, you must function as if God does not exist. Sometimes methodological naturalism is called provisional atheism or benchtop atheism. This restriction makes methodological naturalism functionally equivalent to philosophical naturalism, naturalism rendering science an inherently atheistic enterprise, though again its practitioners well may believe God exists. And I want to make it clear that I reject methodological naturalism. As Dr. Babuna says, I think that science can indeed point to the role a creator plays in the origin of life. But the consequences are significant. Methodological naturalism restricts available explanations for the universe and phenomena in the universe, again, like the origin of humanity. Certain explanations are off the table a priori. As a consequence, intelligent design or creationism cannot be part of the construct of science. Any explanation that states an intelligent agent is responsible, say, for the origin of humanity, is prohibited. As a result, human evolution is the only available alternate for somebody who is trying to scientifically account for the origin of humanity. The net effect is human evolution is true by default, regardless of the evidence at hand. No matter how much evidence exists challenging the evolutionary paradigm, it cannot be supplanted because there is no other alternative that is allowed in the enterprise of science. A statement by Harvard evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin powerfully makes this point. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods of science and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept the material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. I hope you see what's going on here. Many people claim there's overwhelming evidence for human evolution, but I would argue otherwise. Instead, I hope to show you that the case for human evolution is largely philosophical in its construction. In essence, many of the scientific community simply choose to interpret scientific data from within the evolutionary framework. But if one relaxes these restrictions, it is possible to view the same evidence that many people cite as the most compelling evidence for human evolution as fully compatible with the creation model. Biologists claim two lines of evidence that make the case for human evolution: the hominid fossil record and genetic similarities between humans and great apes. And what I'd like to do is examine each line of evidence. As I mentioned earlier, evolutionary biologists argue that the hominids in the fossil record represent transitional forms documenting the evolutionary ascent of humankind. But if this interpretation is valid, then we should be able to clearly see evolutionary relationships among the hominids in the fossil record and identify a clear evolutionary pathway leading to modern humans. And as of yet, neither of these criteria have been met. Evolutionary biologists have no idea how human evolution proceeded, even assuming it did. Let me develop this point first by examining this diagram. This is a diagram that depicts the hominids, some of the hominids that are found in the fossil record, and attempts to show their evolutionary connections. Diagrams like this are typical in textbooks and in journal articles. In fact, I modeled this after a diagram in a journal article. The blue bars show the time frame when specific hominid species existed on Earth. The blue bars are based on the recovery of fossils from the geological record. The blue bars represent actual data. Note the lines connecting the blue bars. This is an attempt to try to relate the hominids to one another in an evolutionary framework. If you examine the diagram carefully, you'll see that there is a question mark overlaying each of those lines. The question mark represents uncertainty on the part of the scientific community about the precise evolutionary relationships of these different hominids, and note that every line has a question mark on it. In fact, evolutionary diagrams like that, produced by different paleoanthropologists, often significantly differ from one another, reflecting sharp disagreements about the evolutionary relationships among the hominids. And when new fossil species are discovered, or when a new hominid fossil species has been identified in the fossil record, chaos ensues. Instead of bringing resolution to the debates about the evolutionary relationships, these new discoveries create greater dissension and only add to the chaos. It's not uncommon to read headlines that state, "New hominid find rewrites human evolution," or "New hominid discovery shakes the human evolutionary tree." This chaos reveals how uncertain and speculative evolutionary interpretations of the hominid fossil record actually are, and raise questions as to whether or not this model is a proper framework for understanding the natural history of the hominids. In science, new discoveries bring greater clarity and consensus if a theory is valid. But if a theory is not valid, new discoveries lead to chaos and more problems, which is exactly what we see for human evolution. But the problem for human evolution is much more severe. The available data from the fossil record for paleoanthropologists to study is primarily cranial dental data: skull, teeth, and jaws. A few years ago, two paleoanthropologists did a study where they concluded that cranial dental data is inherently unreliable for building evolutionary trees. This is what these researchers say: little confidence can be placed in phylogenies, namely evolutionary trees, generated solely from higher primate cranial dental evidence. The corollary of this is that existing phylogenetic hypotheses about human evolution are unlikely to be reliable. In other words, these two researchers admit that it's impossible to know the evolutionary relationships that exist among the hominids, even if those relationships actually existed. My question is this: if we cannot know the evolutionary relationships that exist among the hominids, how can we be confident that these hominids relate to each other through an evolutionary framework? Another serious problem confronting paleoanthropologists when they try to interpret the hominid fossil record from an evolutionary vantage point is the inability to identify a clear pathway through the fossil record that leads to the emergence of modern humans. Every hominid species depicted in biology textbooks, this includes Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo antecessor, Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus, are all evolutionary side branches and dead ends. No evolutionary biologist thinks that they're part of the human evolutionary tree, but yet they're depicted as being part of that pathway, again in biology textbook. The fact of the matter is, paleoanthropologists have no idea how modern humans evolve. And again, the question I ask this: if we don't know how evolutionary pathways led to the emergence of modern humans, then how can we claim that modern humans evolved? Another problem with interpreting the hominid fossil record from an evolutionary standpoint is the inability of paleoanthropologists to identify common ancestors. Again, here's a typical diagram that shows up in biology textbooks or in journal articles, attempting to identify the relationship among the different hominids. And what I want to do is focus on the top part of the diagram, because this is an attempt to show how modern humans emerged. And in this diagram, the idea is that Homo heidelbergensis, which is this creature right here, gave rise to humans and Neanderthals as separate branches, with this being the last common ancestor of humans and Neanderthals. And then here's Homo antecessor as a predecessor to Homo heidelbergensis. Well, it turns out that in the last year or so, anthropologists have made a number of discoveries of fossils that lead them to conclude that Homo heidelbergensis may not have even existed, that it's a phantom species, it's an imaginary species. And even if it did exist, it doesn't look as if it is the last common ancestor. Recently, a team of paleoanthropologists tried to reconstruct the last common ancestor of humans and Neanderthals by examining dental remains. They looked at 1,200 fossil teeth And from their analysis, they try to reconstruct the tooth anatomy of the last common ancestor shared by humans and Neanderthals. To their disappointment, when they compared their reconstructions to the dental remains of fossils recovered from the geological record, no matches were found. Not for Homo heidelbergensis, not for Homo antecessor, not for Homo erectus. To put it another way, they failed to identify the last common ancestor for humans and Neanderthals. I see this as a really big problem for human evolution. In my view, if we cannot confidently identify the last common ancestor in human evolutionary scenarios, we are justified to be skeptical about human evolution. Even though paleontologists face these problems and many, many more when they try to interpret the hominid fossil record from an evolutionary vantage point, they will not entertain alternate models from a creation perspective. Why? Because of the restrictions of methodological naturalism. Human evolution must be true by default, and therefore the hominid fossil record is interpreted within an evolutionary framework regardless of the intractable problems associated with those interpretations. So how do I see the hominids from a creation model perspective? I simply see them as animals, creatures that were created by God for His purposes. They existed for a period of time, and then they went extinct. They had some measure of intelligence and emotional capability, as all animals do, but they lacked advanced cognitive abilities, they lacked spiritual capacities, they lacked intelligence, they lacked speech. In a few minutes, I'll talk a little bit about why these hominids shared anatomical features with humans, but at this point I want to make it, the point that I want to make now, is this, that this view of human evolution, namely a creation model view, makes just as much sense of the data at hand as does an evolutionary view. And I would actually argue that you can make an even more powerful case for creation when we think about the origin of properties such as as language, which I'll discuss the origin of language in a few minutes. But right now, I want to turn my attention to the second line of evidence that people cite in favor of human evolution, namely the genetic similarity between humans and the great apes. Molecular biologists have sequenced not only the human genome, but the genomes of chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans, and macaques, old world monkeys. Molecular biologists have sequenced the genomes of Neanderthals and Denisovans using ancient DNA technology. This data does reveal a high degree of genetic similarity between humans and the great apes, and even the hominids. In fact, evolutionary biologists build evolutionary trees from these genetic similarities and differences like the one shown in this diagram. To put it another way, evolutionary biologists interpret these shared features as reflecting an evolutionary history and shared evolutionary descent. When I interact with evolutionary biologists, I hear from them time and time again that this is the only way to make sense of the shared genetic features, that is, an evolutionary history. But once again, we see the influence of methodological naturalism. I agree with evolutionary biologists. If you're adhering to methodological naturalism, then of course this is the only way to interpret the data. You have no choice. But if you're willing to relax the requirements of methodological naturalism, there's other ways you can interpret the genetic data. In fact, there's historical precedence for this. I see these shared similarities as reflecting common design, not common descent. It's interesting that prior to the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, many biologists interpreted shared biological features that can be used to naturally group organisms together in groupings as an archetypical design that existed in the mind of the first cause. In fact, Sir Richard Owen, who's shown on the left-hand side of this diagram, or this figure, was the most preeminent biologist in his time preceding Darwin, and he developed an elaborate theoretical framework to explain biological features that are centered around an archetypical design. Here's how Owen defined the archetype: an ideal, original, or fundamental pattern on which a natural group of animals or systems of organs has been constructed, and to modifications of which the various forms of such animals or organs may be preferred. May be referred. In other words, he saw that these shared features reflected an archetypical design that was then manifested in various ways in the natural order. For Owen, the archetype pointed to a deep and pregnant principle, some archetypical exemplar in which it has pleased the Creator to frame certain of his living creatures. In Owen's mind, the archetype represented design of the highest order. He said this in a presentation to the Royal Institute of Great Britain. The satisfaction felt by the rightly constituted mind must ever be great in recognizing the fitness of parts for their appropriate function. But when the fitness is gained, as in the great toe of the foot of a man and an ostrich, by a structure which at the same time betokens harmonious concord with a common type, the prescient operations of the one cause of all organization become strikingly manifested to our limited intelligence. In other words, Owen marveled at the ability of the Creator to simultaneously satisfy an organism's functional needs within the constraints of an archetypical form. Darwin owed Owen a huge debt. But instead of adopting Owen's archetype, Darwin replaced it with a hypothetical common ancestor. To many people, these shared biological features, whether they're anatomical, physiological, genetic, or biochemical, are viewed as undeniable evidence for common descent. But this is only true in a framework that embraces methodological naturalism. If those philosophical constraints are relaxed, then it's possible to see shared genetic features as reflecting common design, not common descent. And it's possible to apply this concept of an archetype to shared genetic features. In fact, this is a project that Dr. A.J. Roberts and I are undertaking at RTB. We're in the process of developing a genomics model that can explain similarities and differences in the genomes of organisms from a creation model perspective. But what about all the junk DNA in the genomes of organisms? The common perception is that a vast proportion of any genome consists of non-functional junk DNA that are the vestiges, the leftovers of an evolutionary history. In fact, there are shared junk DNA sequences in corresponding locations of the human genome and the genomes of great apes. Many evolutionary biologists would argue that the shared junk DNA sequences only make sense if those junk DNA sequences arose in the last common ancestor and persisted in the different evolutionary lineages that arose from this hypothetical creature. But in the past decade, discovery after discovery indicates that various classes of junk DNA actually have function. This revolution in molecular biology came to a head in 2011. It was at this time that the ENCODE project published phase 2 results. The bottom line is that at minimum, 80% of the human genome consists of functional DNA, with the expectation as phase 3 results become available, that percentage will rise to nearly 100%. This is what Eric Green, the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, said when phase 2 results were published. During the early debates about the Human Genome Project, researchers had predicted that only a few percent of the human genome sequence encoded proteins, the workhorses of the cell, and the rest was junk. We now know that this conclusion is wrong. ENCODE has revealed that most of the human genome is involved in the complex molecular choreography required for converting genetic information into living cells and tissues. The human genome appears to be far more elegant and sophisticated than we could have ever imagined. It displays features that bespeak of a creator's handiwork. With this scientific insight in hand, we can now legitimately view shared junk DNA sequences as reflecting common design, not common descent, because they serve the same functions in the genomes of humans and the great apes. The bottom line is that what is touted as the most compelling evidence for human evolution can be readily accommodated within a creation model framework. It is only because of the philosophical presuppositions that the scientific community holds that this interpretation of the fossil record and the genetic similarities is refused or not allowed. A couple of other points that I want to make very quickly. It is interesting to me that the cornerstone ideas of human evolution are falling by the wayside. For example, in his book, The Descent of Man, Darwin argued that the capabilities that we think make us unique as human beings have their antecedents in the great apes, and that these features gradually arose through an evolutionary process. According to Darwin, in a series of forms graduating insensibly from some ape-like creature to man as he now exists, it would be impossible to fix on any definite point when the term man ought to be used. To put it another way, we're only different in degree, not kind, from the great apes. But this view is changing. A growing number of paleoanthropologists and primatologists are now arguing for human exceptionalism. They argue that human beings are truly different in kind, not different in degree from other creatures. One of these scientists is Thomas Suddendorf, who's not a believer as far as I know. But this is what he writes in his book, The Gap, about human beings. We reflect on and argue about our present situation, our history and our destiny. We envision wonderful, harmonious worlds as easily as we do dreadful tyrannies. Our powers are used for good as they are for bad, and we incessantly debate which is which. Our minds have spawned civilizations and technologies that have changed the face of the earth, while our closest living animal relatives sit unobtrusively in their remaining forest. There appears to be a tremendous gap between human and animal minds. And what is responsible for that gap? Our capacity for symbolism. That sets us apart from all other creatures. Only human beings can represent the world with discrete symbols. We combine and recombine these symbols in a near infinite number of ways to create alternate possibilities. And this symbolism manifests itself in the form of language, art, music, and even body ornamentation or jewelry. Okay. It is our capacity for symbolism that makes us exceptional as human beings. This insight undermines the central theme of the evolutionary paradigm. Now, evolutionary biologists might argue that this symbolism arose in a gradual process where Homo erectus and Neanderthals had proto-symbolism that gave rise to true symbolism in humans. But yet, when we examine the Neanderthal archaeological record, we see no evidence for symbolism whatsoever. Anthropologists Ian Tattersall and Jeffrey Schwartz have written this assessment of Neanderthal capabilities. Among Neanderthals, all claimed instances of symbolism are strongly disputed, and for Homo erectus, there are no specific claims of this kind. We are truly unique and truly exceptional. In my view, the one capacity that exemplifies our exceptional nature as human beings is our capacity for language. The origin of language in human beings defies an evolutionary explanation. Researchers working in this area have come to the recognition that when human beings appear on the scene, language appears suddenly. It coincides uniquely with the origin of humans, and that the first language is as complex as modern-day language. Here's a couple of statements from the scientific literature. A Japanese scientist says this: the hierarchical complexity found in present-day language is likely to have been present in human language since its emergence. Another team of researchers say this: by this reckoning, the language faculty is an extremely recent acquisition in our lineage, and it was acquired not in the context of slow, gradual modification of pre-existing structures under natural selection, but in a single, rapid emergent event that built upon those prior systems but was not predicted by them. The relatively sudden origin of language poses difficulties that may be called Darwin's problem. The origin of language defies an evolutionary explanation, yet the sudden appearance of complex language is exactly what I would expect if human beings are the product of a creator's hand. And then one final point that I want to make very, very quickly, and that is work from molecular anthropology has produced results that are extremely provocative. Molecular anthropology is an area where scientists are looking at genetic variability of people around the world to reconstruct human origins. And that variability is harbored in the DNA molecule. So they sample DNA from people around the world. And this data indicates that, that using a number of different genetic markers, that humanity originated recently, thousands of years ago, in a single location from a very small population. And this location is very close to where theologians think the Garden of Eden may have been. Moreover, when we look at mitochondrial DNA, it shows us that every person on the planet traces an origin back to a single ancestral sequence. that people think corresponds to a single female individual, and every man on the planet using Y chromosomal data as a genetic marker traces an origin back to a single sequence that people think corresponds to a single male individual. And in the scientific literature, these are dubbed mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. This is astounding, but every one of us in this room has come from the same pair of individuals when you look at mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomal DNA as genetic markers. And it makes me wonder, and I'll close with this thought, have scientists provided us with evidence for Adam and Eve as described in Genesis 1, the first book of the Torah, and also in the Quran as I understand it? Anyway, thank you.